our last talk of the session today is going to be by Dustin Chacón and colleagues, who will, and this title is beautiful, will be telling us about paying attention to agreement. rTPJ aids the encoding of agreement in Hindi. So take it away, Dustin, whenever you're ready.
All right, thank you. So thank you for the introduction. So this is a talk that's presenting on some preliminary results that we've collected in MEG, looking for the neural circuitry that underpins processing and representing of agreement. It's part of a larger project in which we're looking at multiple South Asian languages. Today, I'm just going to be talking about Hindi. As I said, it is preliminary results, and as often happens, the data has changed a little bit from when we wrote the abstract to actually writing the talk. So I want to give my mea culpa right now. It doesn't look like rTPJ is still interesting, but the position in the brain where the effect that we're looking at happens has moved around a little bit. But the real point I want to make is the where question is up in the air, but the when question is what I'm most interested in today. And that I think we feel a little bit more confident about. So first of all, let's remind ourselves what agreement is and why we care about this topic. So agreement is the name of that syntactic relation that holds typically between some head expression like a verb and some dependent expression, usually a noun phrase argument. In English, we see person and number agreement. So in English, the verb be changes depending on the number of the subject in the third person. Hindi has person, number, and also gender agreement. So in Hindi, Hindi is an SOV language, so the verb is at the end here. And in Hindi, the vowel corresponds to masculine gender and E corresponds to feminine gender, more or less. So here we see Larka kita parta tha, which means a boy read some book, and Larki kita parti thi means a girl read some book. We care about agreement because it's taken by psycholinguists to be one of the cues by which comprehenders can search for and find the arguments of a verb. And from the perspective of syntactic theory, it's also seen as kind of the mechanism by which we can stitch together the syntactic representation of the sentence. So if you're interested, like I am, in how the brain represents and processes syntax, you need to say something about how the brain handles agreement. So there is a lot of work that's been done on the processing of agreement. A lot of the work that's been done has been using kind of behavioral techniques to compare the response to grammatical verbs versus ungrammatical verbs. And in this literature, I think it's fair to say there's kind of two camps that have arisen. One camp really emphasizes encoding processes that occur before the verb is encountered. So for instance, if I hear a sentence beginning with some boys, at that point, I have to identify boys as the controller of agreement, and I have to project the relevant morphological features onto the upcoming verb, which I haven't seen yet. This is in contrast with theories that emphasize activity that occurs at the verb, in which we may need to retrieve the controller of agreement to check their relation, for instance. From the perspective of neurolinguistics, there's also been a lot of work specifically looking at the ERP signal that happens at the verb. Again, this primarily focuses on contrasting grammatical versus ungrammatical agreement, and we know a great deal about what's happening at the verb. I think it's fair to say that we know less about how the brain handles that initial hypothetical part, right? That encoding process that is hypothesized to exist. There are also a lot of work, there's some work that's been done in kind of functional neuroimaging that have identified a large number of parts of the brain that seem to be implicated in processing agreement. So for instance, in fMRI, we found that a lot of the left lateralized language network, including left inferior frontal gyrus and middle and posterior temporal gyrus, are implicated. But also this includes many right areas. So for instance, the right precuneus, posterior cingulate, and right inferior parietal areas. These are surprising because we don't really tend to think of these as language-related areas. There's also some recent work from MEG that have also found temporal regions as well as left anterior temporal lobe and also left inferior frontal gyrus. So one thing I want to say here is that a lot of this research has been done in fMRI, and fMRI has poor temporal resolution, meaning that if you're really curious at trying to find out what the brain is doing before the verb is encountered, it's a little challenging to know what your results are reflecting. Are they reflecting that part of the process or something that happens after the verb? Additionally, there's another issue that I want to address here. So the research question that I'm interested in today is, can we identify some neural signature for identifying and labeling a noun as an agreement controller and potentially for kind of forecasting the features that we will see on the verb? One of the issues that I think that we haven't solved yet is that this initial encoding stage is going to be kind of by necessity confounded with many other syntactic and semantic factors, right? So in English, if I hear a sentence beginning with the cat, at that point, yes, I may predict that the verb will be a third person singular form, but I'm also going to predict that the lexical item might be meows, more likely than barks, that the cat is going to be the subject, and so on and so forth. So what I'm going to use today is I'm going to use some properties of Hindi to try to dig a little deeper into this question. So Hindi is a split ergative language, and it also has a contextual agreement system, which I will kind of describe in detail here. But the basic idea here is that we can use some grammatical properties of Hindi to get a picture of what the brain is doing when it encounters a noun phrase that controls agreement, and then compare that to a picture of what the brain is doing when the noun phrase, it's the same noun phrase with the same morphological structure and the same thematic relation to the verb, but doesn't control agreement, right? So we can kind of control for some of these factors a little bit better than has been done in other situations. I want to give credit where credit's due. So a lot, I think in some work that Sakshi Bhatia has recently done, the problem of identifying a noun phrase as agreement controller has been really forefronted. So if you look at Western European languages, this is not really an issue, right? In Western European languages, the relevant noun phrase is always the subject, and there's not really much you have to worry about there. But when you look outside of Western European languages, this problem becomes a little bit more obvious, I should say. Additionally, I also want to say that there's kind of a parallel set of work that's being done by Kamal Kumar Chaudhary that uses a similar design as what we're doing and also uses electrophysiological measures, but does not, is asking a slightly different question than what we're asking today. So let me just quickly go over the properties of the Hindi agreement systems. That way we can understand the context of the experiment. So Hindi is a differential object marking language. What that means is that the object noun phrase is marked with the accusative case ko when it's an animate object. If it's an inanimate object, then it's optional. The inanimate object noun phrase can be marked with ko if it has a particular specific interpretation. So here's kind of a minimal pair here. Ladka kitab padhta tha means a boy read some book or another, but ladka kitab ko padhta tha means a boy read a particular book. The other factor that is orthogonal to this question of the case features on the object is split ergativity. So Hindi uses the ergative morpheme ne when the verb is in the perfective aspect, but if it's in a different aspect, if it's imperfective, progressive, or future, then the subject is not received as ne, it's instead bear. So here we have ladka kitab ko padhta tha, a boy read a particular book. But if we put this in the perfective, ladke ne kitab ko padha tha, a boy has read a particular book. So these are, like I said, these are orthogonal. So we can kind of manipulate both of these things separately. Additionally, Hindi has this phenomenon wherein the verbal complex agrees with the noun phrase that's the highest in the structure, but does not have a case marking on it. Let's think through what this means incrementally, right? So if we are hearing a sentence that begins with a bare subject, we can crown that noun phrase as the agreement controller. And we also know what features we can forecast onto the verb. So for instance, if we hear a bare masculine subject, we know the verb will be bare. It doesn't really matter what happens in the object noun phrase time window. By contrast, if we hear an ergative subject, we don't know what form the verb is going to take yet. So the subject is not a relevant cue for knowing exactly what feature we'll see on the verb. Instead, we have to look at the next noun phrase, and the next noun phrase will be the relevant cue. If that next noun phrase is a bare object, then the bare object gets to be the controller of agreement, right? So we put the crown on the object noun phrase in this case. By contrast, so if we see that the object noun phrase is also case marked, right? So if it has this specific interpretation, then the verb actually surfaces as a third person singular masculine default. Now, I want to point out here that the object noun phrase is still the relevant cue for what agreement feature you'll get onto the verb, but the difference here is that it's not the agreement controller. So the verb does not actually match in features with the object noun phrase. Instead, in the ergative subject accusative object condition, both noun phrases are ineligible for agreement. There's one way to say this. So this is essentially the heart of the study, right? What we want to know is we want to know what the neural activity looks like in the object noun phrase. And we want to see if there's kind of a special neural response that we see when a bare object noun phrase is the controller of agreement due to the syntactic context it finds itself in versus when that same object noun phrase is not the controller of agreement. And then the accusative object is kind of our comparison class. So that's essentially the design. As I said before, the question here is there a particular signal for encoding agreement before the verb is encountered for the ergative subject bear object case? We're also going to include as kind of a sanity check, kind of a traditional N400 manipulation in which we manipulate the closed probability of the lexical stem of the verb. In the interest of time, I will not actually discuss those results today, but just suffice to say that they are there. So it's a 2x2x2 design. We have 46 sets of 8 items. The subject noun phrases are always animate and the object noun phrases are always inanimate. This is kind of a necessity of the design. And we also counterbalance the gender features such that in half of the items, the subject was masculine and the object was feminine, and the other half the reverse. And then we also norm those results. The task is a very simple task. It's a RSVP picture matching task. So each phrase occurs centered on a screen for approximately 900 milliseconds with a 100 millisecond interstimulus interval. So the windows of analysis will be 1 second. This may seem a little bit long, but remember that we're actually having readers read entire phrases. And also it's kind of received wisdom that reading times are a bit slower for the Devanagari script compared to other languages. After about a quarter of trials, there's a picture matching task where participants respond to whether the sentence corresponds to a stock photo that we took from pexels.org. And it's a within subjects design, so participants see every single trial and MEG signals are continuously recorded. Right, and this is just a picture, right? So again, it's very simple. They read words phrase by phrase, and at the end, they respond to whether a picture corresponds to the stimulus. So the first analysis that we did was a censored space decoding analysis. So this is a technique wherein we take all of the brain data and then we classify the data based off of some criterion of interest that we're interested in, and then we treat the accuracy of that classifier as a dependent variable, essentially. So the idea here is we took all of the stimuli and then we classified the brain's data on what the gender feature of the noun is, of the verb, right? So we split the data into masculine verbs versus feminine verbs, and then we trained a classifier on the brain data to try to find, to try to guess what the gender of the verb will be. We use 5-fold cross-validation for the training of this classifier. Afterwards, we calculated the score of the classifier for the sentences with an ergative subject in which the object is the relevant cue for the verb feature. And we compared that to the score for the classifier on the bare subject conditions, which is where the subject is the relevant cue for the features of the verb. Afterwards, we did temporal clustering, and we did cluster-based permutation tests on the t-values comparing these. So that is, we did the t-tests for these score values at every millisecond, and then we clustered we looked for significant clusters of adjacent time points where these t-values were significant. Afterwards, we randomly permuted the labels and recomputed the clusters in order to define a null distribution against which we compared the observed results. And that's what we'll report on today. I should also say we're currently reporting on 18 subjects. So we ran 19 and we excluded 1 due to noise. So this is the first result here. So the orange line here, this is a bit confusing. The orange line corresponds to the accuracy of the classifier trained on the sentences where the subject is ergative, meaning that the object is the relevant signal to the comprehender as to what verb feature they should expect. The blue line then corresponds to what happens when the subject is the relevant cue for the verb's gender feature. And the gray block here corresponds to where we found a significant cluster. So this is a very big cluster, right? So the way to interpret this is somewhere between 200 and 800 milliseconds after the onset of the object noun phrase, the brain data is more predictive of the gender feature that the verb will get and the next word over when the object is the relevant cue for the gender of the verb. This is compared to when the subject is the relevant feature. There's no significant clusters in the subject noun phrase time window, but you probably noticed that there is a little peak here that may or may not be interesting in a few more subjects. So that's already indicative, right, that the brain is doing something in the object noun phrase time window, but now we want to dig a little bit more deeper to see whether there's something special about kind of encoding a noun phrase as the agreeer. And we also want to try to find out where in the brain this might be happening. So the next analysis I want to discuss is a single trial regression analysis. So this is a two-stage analysis. So what we did is we took all the sensor data, we projected it into source space using the BEM algorithm in MNE Python, and then we averaged the signal in 11 regions of interest. These 11 regions of interest include kind of the left lateralized language network, which includes left inferior frontal gyrus, left anterior and posterior temporal lobe, and left temporal parietal junction. We also included left and right occipital temporal regions, which included the VWFA and the right homologue to this. We also included bilateral ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is sometimes implicated in semantic processing. And we included the right homologues of the left lateralized language network. This is interesting, again, because in agreement processing in fMRI, right areas sometimes light up. So we want to see what's going on in right regions. Afterwards, we averaged the signal in each of these regions, and then we conducted a regression on the signal at each millisecond. And after we conducted the regression on each millisecond, we then took the beta coefficients, and then we computed the one sample t-tests over those beta coefficients to try to find which factors are significantly different than 0. That's one way to think about it. The regressions that we ran included the case features in the object, in both the object and the verb time window. We also included the gender of the expected verb form. We also included some nuisance factors that we wanted to kind of marginalize over, right? Including the log lexical frequency of the nouns or the verb in that time window, the gender of the nouns, because that's kind of a between item variable that we didn't really want to explore, and also the verb entropy and also the position of the stimuli in the experiment. After that, we then conducted cluster-based permutation tests on the results of those t-tests. The plots that I'm going to show you are, we go back and refit the intercept, and then we refit the effect after of these regressions. So first, before I show you anything else, don't look at this yet. Before I tell you anything else, we find that pretty much every variable that we looked for is significant at the verb in some brain region. This is probably not a surprise. We're looking at a head final language. Everything is kind of, the verb is kind of what everything is building up to, right? So all of the linguistic material that the participant is encountering is likely going to influence their predictions over various features of the verb, including the lexical item itself. Also, the verb is different across conditions, so that's, again, not super surprising. Additionally, we also find that in the subject noun phrase time window, there's multiple effects of the subject case, and similarly in the object noun phrase time window, there's effects of the object. Again, that's not surprising because these are different words or different morphological structures, and they also have different semantic import. But what is interesting is that we do find 3 significant clusters associated with the interaction between these. And what I'm plotting here is the fitted intercept, and then the fitted effect of ergative subject and bare object. And what we found is in right posterior temporal lobe, which is the right homologue of an area that's often thought to be implicated in syntax, we find an effect around 400 to 500 milliseconds of the critical condition. Slightly before that, we also find similar effects in right inferior frontal gyrus and ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which again, RIFG is the right homologue to Broca's area, right, LIFG. We also slightly after that, around 600 to 700 milliseconds, find an effect of the expected verb gender. We find a difference in activity between when the expected verb gender is feminine versus when it's masculine. And this happens slightly afterwards in 600 milliseconds. It also happens in right posterior temporal lobe and also in left occipital temporal regions. And I want to mention, just to clarify again, that this is different from effects of the noun gender, which again is a between item variable, and unsurprisingly, we find many significant clusters of the different words involved in the experiment. So that's separate from the effect of the expected verb gender. So just to start kind of wrapping up here. So the summary, right, there's a question about where in the brain is agreement processing occurring and which what phase of processing should we be interested in looking at. One thing that is interesting is that LIFG and LATL are kind of prime candidates for agreement processing in the neurolinguistic literature, but those are not particularly interesting areas in the analysis we've looked at so far. But I do think that the when question, as I said, does seem to be, we have some kind of answer to this, I think. By using using these particular properties of Hindi, we can try to control for some variables that are hard to control for otherwise. And once we do that, we do seem to see some signal. One signal is this difference in the accuracy of the brain data and the decoding analysis. And the other signal that we want to maybe put on the table as possibly being relevant for encoding of agreement are these effects that we see in the right posterior temporal lobe, right inferior frontal gyrus, ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And then slightly after that, we see this effect of the verb's gender in right posterior temporal lobe and left occipital temporal regions. Some future questions. So why these regions, right? I was frankly surprised that we found all these right regions were implicated. I don't have a story for this. One thing that we want to do next is start to look at the relationship between these regions and do some kind of connectivity analysis between those regions and the verb gender regions. As I mentioned, this is also part of a larger project. So interestingly, Nepali is a language that, this is very superficial, but Nepali is a language that has essentially the same case system as Hindi, but without this variable agreement system. In other words, we can run the exact same experiment in Nepali, but without having the question of object agreement versus subject agreement. Therefore, it's possible, if we want to say that there's some neural signal that we think has to do with encoding agreement in Hindi, that signal ought to be absent in Nepali. I will say from preliminary data, that seems to be the case, but I'm not presenting on that today. Additionally, there's interesting questions here about production versus comprehension, which I don't think I have the time to discuss. So with that, I'd like to thank my collaborators, Dhanyavad. I'd also like to say specifically thank you to Shrestha, who is kind of my co-collaborator in this and who has run all the Nepali subjects and is kind of the lead on the Nepali version of this. And with that, I think I'm open for questions.